The Hesychastic Life of the Young Mother of God. An excerpt from Saint Gregory Palamas' 53rd homily on the entry into the Holy of Holies of our exceedingly pure Lady Mother of God and Ever Virgin Mary, and her divine manner of life there. First, a reading from the Synaxarion for the feast. The entrance of the Lady Theotokos into the temple of the law is the cause of a wonderful and universal feast for Orthodox Christians. Also because this took place in a paradoxical manner, and it is an introduction to the majestic and awesome mystery of the incarnation of God the Word, who through the Theotokos was destined to be born into the world. The starting point for this feast of the entrance took place as follows. Anna, who is known to all, because she was barren nearly all her life and unable to have a child, after supplications to the Master of creation with her husband Joachim, was granted a child. And having been granted what they longed for, immediately they dedicated the child born to them to God. Therefore, in a paradoxical way was born the one who would produce the salvation of the race of men, the cause of the refashioning of fallen Adam, and of his resurrection and theosis. We call her the most holy and Lady Theotokos Mary. Wherefore, when she turned 3 years old, her parents took her and offered her on this day to the temple. And in fulfillment to the obligations they made, they dedicated their daughter to God who gave her to them. So they handed her over to the priests, and the high priest of that time, Zechariah. Having received her, he took her into the innermost section of the temple, where only the high priest entered once a year. This was done according to God's will, because she was soon destined to give birth for the restoration and salvation of the world. Therefore, the Virgin remained there for 12 years, fed in a strange manner by the Archangel Gabriel with heavenly food. She was made worthy by God of these appearances until the time came for the divine annunciation and that heavenly and supernatural message which stated that it was God's good pleasure to receive flesh from her for the love of mankind, to refashion this world corrupted by sin. Then the Theotokos came out of the Holy of Holies and was given to her betrothed Joseph, that he may guard her and testify to her virginity, and also to serve her and the child born without seed, from the time of their flight into Egypt until their return to the land of Israel. Starting in section 46, Saint Gregory teaches, "But let us bring our address back from there, for it is obviously beyond the scope of mortal men and their minds to go so deep, and take up again the theme we have before us. The Virgin entered the Holy of Holies. At once she looked around, and, when she saw that it pleased her, she felt it was a suitable place for her to stay. Through the beauty of what she saw, she immediately cast her mind's eye to unseen beauties, and no longer counted anything on earth delightful. Having risen above the needs of human nature and the pleasures of the senses, she decided that sights that are fair to look upon are not even worth seeing, and that things that are good to eat should be ignored. In this way, she was the first and only person to be shown to be in no danger from him who imposes his tyranny on us by these means, and in her turn she triumphed over him. She did not struggle with him just from morning until evening, nor just concerning the fruit of one plant, but for the space of many years in respect of all the various pleasures invented by the powers of darkness as bait to catch souls. This holy maid, alone of mankind, utterly despised all these delights while still an infant, and as a reward was rightly brought food from heaven by an angel, by which she was physically strengthened, and which served as a testimony that her way of life was worthy of heaven. In fact, if I may say something highly fitting and appropriate to the dignity of the ever-virgin bride, right from the beginning she was shown to be the Queen of Heaven, as she had heavenly beings to wait upon her. She lived, as though in paradise, in a place removed from the earth, or rather, as though in the courts of heaven, for that sanctuary was a symbol of those courts. Thus she led an unencumbered life without cares or occupation, free from sorrow, with no share in base passions, above that pleasure which is inseparable from pain. She lived for God alone and was sustained and preserved only by Him who was to pitch His tent among us through her. Obviously, she saw only God, making God her delight and continually waiting on Him. With profound understanding, she listened to the writings of Moses and the revelation of the other prophets when, every Saturday, all the people gathered outside, as the law ordained. She learnt about Adam and Eve and everything that happened to them, how they were brought out of non-being, settled in paradise, and given a commandment there, about the evil one's ruinous counsel and the resulting theft, about their expulsion from paradise on that account, the loss of immortality, and the change to this way of life, full of pain. In addition, she saw that as time passed, life continued under the inherited curse and grew ever worse. God's creature made in His image was estranged from the Creator and became more and more closely associated with the one who had evilly schemed to crush him. Alas, for the evil one's power over us and his insatiable rage against us. Woe to our insensitivity and our inclination to return to the earth. No one was capable of putting an end to this impulse which brings destruction on all men alike, or to the uncheckable rush of our race toward hell. When the Holy Virgin Maid heard and understood this, she was filled with pity for humanity, and with the aim of finding a remedy to counteract this great affliction, she resolved at once to turn with her whole mind to God. She took it upon herself to represent us, to constrain Him who is above compulsion, and quickly draw Him towards us, that He might remove the curse from among us, halt the advance of the fire-burning men's souls, weaken our enemies, answer our prayers, shine upon us with light that never sets, and having healed our sickness, unite His creature with Himself. Having thought over these things so relevant to her, the Virgin full of grace interceded for all humanity in an amazing way defying description, seeking to converse persuasively and honestly with God, to whom she came as a self-appointed ambassador, or rather as one ordained by Him. She eagerly examined every type of virtue, those proclaimed in the law and those discovered by reason, and by men devoted to both. She considered every aspect of each of the principal branches of learning as though they were impressions left by a seal, her intention being to discover which was most akin to God, and which had taken its imprint from Him, and was therefore capable of impressing His image on its adherents, wiping out the marks made by material concerns. Since the Virgin recognized that nothing revealed by men before her time went this far, she inaugurated something better and more perfect. She invented, put into practice, and handed down to those who came after her, a practice higher than any vision, and a vision as far superior to that which was formerly so highly acclaimed as the truth is superior to imagination. The greatness of this mystery can be briefly stated. I shall utter words which are beneficial to all Christians, but especially to those who have renounced the world. Through what I say, you may be able to taste those good things to come, to stand with angels and become a citizen of heaven, since you wish to emulate as far as possible the ever-virgin bride who was the first and only person to forsake the world from infancy for the world's sake. The goodness she practiced while shut away encompassed every kind of virtue, all those which had been discovered before her time and were openly bestowed on those men we have mentioned, and adorned their characters, and by means of which domestic and civil affairs were well managed. The other aspect of the Virgin, however, superior to what we have recounted, is entirely knowledge, through which we may search out natural principles, and as far as lies within our grasp, contemplate the analogies, figures, and quantities of the soul and things which are inseparably separable from matter. Let us consider, from a theological and philosophical point of view, things completely free from matter, a subject which the Greeks, or rather the fathers and patrons of the art, called the first philosophy, being unaware of any higher kind of contemplation. Even this, although it contains some truth, is as far removed from the vision of God and as different from converse with Him, as possessing is distinct from knowing. Saying something about God is not the same as encountering Him. Speaking of God requires that you pronounce words, and perhaps that you have some skill with them, if you are not just to have knowledge, but to make use of it and pass it on. It also requires all sorts of logical reasoning, compelling arguments and worldly examples, all or most of which are gathered by seeing and hearing, and are the prerogative of people who spend their lives in this world. They may be acquired by the wise men of this present age, even though their lives and souls may not be completely pure. It is absolutely impossible, however, to truly encounter God unless, in addition to being cleansed, we go outside, or rather, beyond ourselves, leaving behind everything perceptible to our senses, together with our ability to perceive, and being lifted up above thoughts, reason, and every kind of knowledge, above even the mind itself, and wholly given over to the energy of spiritual perception, which Solomon calls divine awareness. We attain to that unknowing which lies beyond knowledge, that is to say, above every kind of much vaunted philosophy, even though the purpose of the most excellent part of philosophy is knowledge. Seeking after this, for it is absolutely necessary for ambassadors to meet those to whom they have been sent, the Virgin found that holy stillness was her guide, stillness, in which the mind and the world stand still, forgetfulness of the things below, initiation into the things above, the laying aside of ideas for something better. This is true activity, a means of approaching contemplation, or to state it more aptly, the vision of God, which is the only proof of a soul in good health. Every other virtue is like healing medicine for the soul's illnesses and the evil passions which have put down roots in it through sloth. Contemplation, by contrast, is the fruit of a healthy soul. It aims to achieve a certain end and is a kind that deifies. For it is through contemplation that a person is made divine, not by speculative analogies on the basis of skillful reasoning and observations. Perish the thought, for that would be something base and human, but under the guidance of stillness, continuing in our life's upper room, as it were, in prayers and supplications night and day. In some way we touch that blessed nature that cannot be touched. Thus, those whose hearts have been purified by holy stillness, inasmuch as they have been ineffably permeated by the light that transcends both sense and mind, see God within themselves as in a mirror. The immediate proof of this is the Virgin, who, having kept company with quietness from her earliest age, brings the greatest benefit to us, and commends to God those in need as no one else can. She alone lived in holy quiet from such early childhood, in a manner surpassing nature, and she alone of the human race bore the Word, who is the God-man, without knowing man. We must, however, return to our subject in order to make this great principle easy for those who have ears to grasp. I admire that type of eulogy which benefits the hearers by revealing to them the way of salvation. And even if it is the case that some of the phrases are difficult to understand and cannot easily be comprehended by those whose minds lack concentration, I do not think such words should be banished from the holy precincts. For we do not avoid the narrow way which leads to life simply because it is difficult to follow. Onward, then, my brave companions, as many of you as do not prefer easily earned dust to hard-won gold, and let each of you gather his mind within itself, just as men going along narrow passageways gather up their cloaks, and ascend intently toward the majesty of this thought. For there is no accessible means of ascent to so highly exalted a meaning, for those who creep along the ground. Once, however, you have lifted your minds above material concerns and resolved to meditate on the Mother of God's divine way of life in the holy sanctuary, eager to understand something of what happened there and to emulate her as far as possible, then perhaps you will soon receive that blessed gift of those purified in heart, and invisibly observe the honors proper to the immortal world. Man, the greater world contained in a lesser, is the combination of all things, the recapitulation of God's creation, which is why he was produced last of all, just as we put an epilogue at the end of speeches. In fact, you could say that this universe is the composition of the person of the Word himself. Man, then, brings his mind and senses into unity with the greater wisdom of him who is able to mingle elements that cannot be mixed, by using his imagination, opinion, and thought as intermediaries, as genuine bonds of the extremes. Something similar occurs with the four perceptible elements which make up the world around us. Air mediates between fire and water between air and earth, and thus opposites are bound together, and peace is established between conflicting elements, without them in any way losing their mutually repelling properties. Thus it is with the world, which is great in size. Thus it is with man, who is great in honor. In this way, man and the world are in communion with each other. But whereas the world is greater than man in magnitude, man transcends it in intelligence. He is stored up like treasure within the world, like a very precious object kept in a large house and worth much more than the building that contains it. Or like many-colored, costly royal robes, not like the king himself, for this honor has been lost, within the palace, where the palace is made of stones which, though huge, can be bought cheaply by anyone, whereas royal robes are made with small but precious stones which are hard to come by. How much greater is the mind than the heavens! It is the image of God, knows God, and alone of everything on earth can, if it wishes, become God, exalting man's humble body at the same time. How much more excellent are man's senses than the earth! They can comprehend not just the earth's dimensions, its bulk and its various qualities, but ascend through knowledge to the heavenly spheres, understand their various movements, be aware of all the various and perhaps significant ways in which stars come together and separate, and thus lay the foundation, as it were, for the science of astronomy. Even the things in between the heavens and the earth are worth less than what lies on the boundary between man's mind and his senses, for although they serve the same purpose in our analogy, in context, they are as different as can be. Man's senses are a non-rational power, capable of knowing and comprehending perceptible objects when they are present. Imagination has its starting point in the senses, but exercises its abilities even in the absence of objects, which can be perceived by the senses. It could perhaps also be called mind, insofar as it can act without such objects. Although as not existing outside divisible things, it is passive. Opinions originating from the imagination are irrational judgments, but not those which come from reasoning, for the ability to form opinions is natural to both. Man's reasoning is always logical, and comes eventually, by means of gradual process, to opinions in accordance with reason. All these mental powers were formed and act by means of the primary organ, man's natural spirit with the brain. The mind, by contrast, has no organ, but is in essence complete in itself, able to operate independently, even though it lowers itself to the level of man's natural life, which develops through reasoning. But why have I set out these divisions and distinctions now? Why did I first enumerate the types of virtues, then afterwards the soul's powers? Because the seeds of those virtues come from these faculties, and their whole existence stems from them. Since, therefore, the divinely wise Virgin could not reap from the virtues the closest possible relationship to God, she investigated the soul's capabilities to see whether she might perhaps discover a means of attaining to oneness with Him. Some of them she found to be completely irrational and incapable of rising above things perceptible to the senses. As for the capacity to form opinions and concepts, although these are rational powers, they are not detached from that storehouse of the senses, the imagination, and what is more, they also function through the organ of man's natural spirit. She prudently understood what the Apostle too said later, "The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God." She therefore looked for something higher, a truly spiritual life, unadulterated with earthly concerns, and in a way which goes beyond the limitations of created nature. She longed for God and heavenly union with Him. Just as it is impossible to desire visible light without desiring the sun, so it was with her. She found that the purest thing in us, the only perfect and indivisible essence that we have, is precisely intended by nature for this holy and divine love. As the greatest power of the soul, the mind refines and unifies even those processes of reason upon which the things pertaining to the sciences are based, which creep forward almost like reptiles, together or individually, making inferences and interpretations. Although the mind can come down to the level of human reasoning and buy it to a life full of complexities, since its energies are available for all, yet it indubitably has another superior mode of operation, which it is capable of putting into action by itself. For it is able to reason on its own, either when separated from the body and the things pertaining to the body, or when, although still bound to it, it is enabled by means of diligence and assisted by divine grace to leave behind this varied, complex, and lowly way of living. It is like a rider who is certainly capable of activity eminently superior to merely holding the reins, and could put it into effect on its own, not only if he were to dismount, but even on horseback or in a chariot, had he not deliberately devoted his entire attention simply to guiding the horse. In the same way, if the mind did not wholly revolve without ceasing around base concerns, it could be given over to superior, more exalted activity, namely, that which is proper to it, and which is the sole means by which it can enter into union with God. This is, however, far more difficult, because it is by nature intertwined with the body, and entangled with material knowledge and all the different ties that bind this life to earthly matters, and are hard to lay aside. The all-pure Virgin threw off those ties from the very beginning of her life, and withdrew from people. She escaped from a blameworthy way of life, and chose to live in solitude out of sight of all, inside the sanctuary. There, having loosed every bond with material things, shaken off every tie, and even risen above sympathy towards her own body, she united her mind with its turning towards itself and attention, and with unceasing holy prayer. Having become her own mistress by this means, and being established above the jumble of thoughts in all their different guises, and above absolutely every form of being, she constructed a new and indescribable way to heaven, which I would call silence of the mind. Intent upon this silence, she flew high above all created things, saw God's glory more clearly than Moses, and beheld divine grace, which is not at all within the capacity of men's senses, but is a gracious and holy sight for spotless souls and minds. Partaking of this vision, she became, according to the sacred hymnographers, a radiant cloud of the truly living water, the dawn of the mystical day, and the fiery chariot of the Word. Without the visitation of divine grace, even if a mind were to discover divine awareness, it could not see anything or act on its own, just as the eye can do nothing without visible light. To those who are eternal, that is to say, to those who are like God, He is nothing but light, and as the sun is to visible objects, so God is to what the mind perceives. Man's sight, when it is in action, itself becomes light, communes with the light and sees with the light, and the first thing it beholds is this light poured out on everything visible. In exactly the same way, anyone fortunate enough to attain to the divine energy and to undergo divine transformation himself becomes completely like the light, is with the light, and by means of the light sees clearly things which, were it not for this great and inexpressible grace, would be invisible to all. For it is beyond not only the bodily senses, but also everything that can be known by us, and indeed it is invisible even to those who surpass us in natural power. According to the Lord's beatitude, which cannot prove false, those whose hearts have been purified see God, who, in the words of the great theologian John, the son of thunder, is light, and dwells in and reveals himself to those who love him and are loved by him, in accordance with his own promise to them. He appears to the purified mind as though in a mirror, although in himself he is invisible. For such is the form reflected in a mirror. It appears but cannot be seen, and it is utterly impossible for anyone to see the reflection in the mirror and at the same time the object being reflected. This is how God is seen now, by those cleansed by divine love, but then, it says, they shall see him face to face. But who ever loved God more than she, whom we now praise? And who was ever loved by God more than she? What other creature could ever be purer than she, or equal to her in purity, or anywhere near as pure? For this reason, she alone of all mankind throughout the ages was initiated into the highest mysteries by these divine visions, was united in this way with God, and became like him. She then accomplished the superhuman role of intercessor on our behalf, and brought it to perfection through herself, not just acquiring the exaltation of mind that lies beyond reason, but using it for the sake of us all, and achieving this great and surpassingly great deed by means of her boldness towards God. For she did not merely come to resemble God, but she also made God in the likeness of man, not just by persuading him, but by conceiving him without seed and bearing him in a way past telling. Having been refashioned by God through grace, which is why she was addressed as "Thou that art full of grace" by the archangel, she shaped God in human form, which is why she was given the good tidings with the greeting, "Rejoice,